Hello, and thank you for participating in our grass workshop. My name is Lindsay Gonzalez. I'm the Small Acreage Management Coordinator for Boulder County. Today, I'm going to be talking about grasses and how they grow and some basics of grass identification. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about why grasses are important and why do we care. Um, so grasses are important all across the world, but just focusing here in Colorado, we have around 32 million acres of agricultural land in Colorado. About 4% of that is pasture land, which we usually consider as an irrigated and or seeded pasture. And about 71.4 of that is rangeland that is used for agricultural production. The majority of the crops in Colorado is wheat and corn, which are both grasses, followed by sorghum and millet, which are also grasses. And then we go on to our non-grasses, potatoes, peaches, and apples. The natural ecosystem of a huge part of Colorado is grasslands or grassland prairies. So thinking about the environmental impact and the wildlife habitat is important because that's what is naturally in a large part of the state. And the quality of life, a lot of us enjoy grasses, whether that be we play sports or watch sports. We use it in our landscaping, or we just enjoy getting out there and maybe hiking or spending time in the natural environment. So some of the important characteristics we're going to talk about with grasses are below. So these are important when we talk about doing grass identification and in understanding how grasses grow. So we're going to talk about annual and perennial grasses, warm season and cool seasons, sod forming and bunch growth, and plant morphology or plant parts of grasses. So annuals and perennials. So we have annual grasses which complete their life cycle in 1 year. So some examples would be wheat, oats, corn, and sorghum. So kind of a lot of common crops there. Teff is a grass we a lot of times use in pasture situations as just a 1 year thing. And then a lot of our kind of weedy grasses that we fight are a lot of them are annual grasses, so just live 1 year. And then we have our perennial grasses, which can live several years or more, can live decades if managed correctly. So some of those common grasses that we see around here are smooth brome, orchard grass, Kentucky bluegrass, and then some of our native grasses would be the blue grama grass and buffalo grass. And then we have some short-lived perennials, which live usually 3 to 5 years. So those could be perennial ryegrass, slender wheatgrass, and mountain brome. So we don't have any true biennial grasses that live 2 years. We have a lot of plants that are biennials, but no grasses are true biennials. Some can act as biennials if they are managed um, in a certain way. So now going on to cool season and warm season grasses. So the majority of the plants in the world are cool season or C3 grasses. They're called C3 because they create a 3 carbon molecule. We won't go into that too much. They're the least efficient grasses, or sorry, the least efficient plants that there are when you look at energy and energy usage and water usage. They usually grow best in weather around 65 to 75 degrees, and usually they have a potential for higher forage quality if you're grazing or doing a hay or silage with grasses. So then we can move on to our warm season grasses. So the plants in the world, there's fewer warm season plants or C4. They create a 4 carbon molecule. Um, so they grow, and a lot of these are grasses. So corn is a common one that we think of. So they grow best in warm weather around 85 to 95 degrees. They usually start growth in May and they go dormant in fall, whereas our cool seasons might start growth earlier and finish later. They're more efficient in how they use their energy. So when we think about the cool season plants, they a lot of times close their stomata, their openings underneath their leaves when it's hot and dry, which can cause oxygen to accumulate. And the plant does something called photorespiration, which can result in 15 to 40% of the light energy lost. Um, versus the C4 plants or warm seasons. And so in these warm seasons, the Calvin cycles actually happen in a whole different area of the cell. So kind of some of the basic differences there. So leaf anatomies and enzymes used differ as well. So think about mowing your lawn, which is usually a cool season grass. We use a lot of Kentucky bluegrass or ryegrasses. So you think, in the spring you're mowing your lawn, it seems like every week it needs to get mowed, and then later on in the summer you can go weeks without mowing your lawn. So those are usually cool season grasses. So there's also a third pathway called CAM, not to do with grasses, but just kind of interesting. So those are the most efficient. They actually close their stomata during the day and open them during night. So that the most common we think about is a lot of the succulents in the cacti. So this graph is just kind of showing you, this is specific to Colorado. This is from the Colorado Forage Guide, which is a great publication. If any of you are interested in it, we can get that to you guys. So if you look at the blue line here on the graph, it shows the cool season grasses, kind of what we expect to see in Colorado. They start growth sometimes like late winter or very early spring, and the majority of their growth happens in that spring and maybe early summer period. Then when we get into the hot part of the year, they really decrease in production. If there's limited water, they can even go dormant. So we call that the summer slump is kind of the common term for that. And then you have another little bump there in the fall where your growth will increase, but not to the point that it had in the spring. And then you look at the red line, your warm season grasses, they're going to start growth a little bit later. Maybe they're in May, start seeing them really start to grow. Their peak is in the hottest part of the summer, and then they kind of stop growth earlier in the year than those cool seasons would. So this is important when you think about how you're going to manage your grasses. What grasses do you have? What kind of grasses they are? It's important. So then we're going to talk about bunch grasses and sod forming grasses. So bunch grasses, just like the name says, they grow in bunches or clumps. They typically have more leaves and potential to produce more forage. That's also important because when you think about the leaves, a lot of the high quality feed is in the leaves. So the protein and more digestible fibers, sugars, all of that. If you have an area that's dominated by bunch grasses, a lot of times you have a lot of bare soil around, so it may look a little different, but that is normal in that case. And then our sod forming grasses, so they spread by underground or above ground modified stems called rhizomes or stolons. So rhizomes would be underground, stolons above ground. They tend to have less bare soil and they can fill in areas pretty quickly because they're spreading through those stems. So some of the common ones are smooth brome that you can see in that upper left picture above there. So it's a lot of our pastures are kind of dominated by smooth brome in the area. And then a lot of our lawn grasses, so Kentucky bluegrass is a sod former. The other one that we use a lot in lawns are starting to use more is the buffalo grass. So that's a native that you can see down in that middle picture surrounding that bunch grass. That is buffalo grass. So that spreads by above ground stems. So you'll be able to easily spot those if you are in an area that has buffalo grass. So now we're going to look at the plant parts. We won't go into too much depth in this. There's a lot of publications out there that have similar diagrams that you guys can look at if you want to really memorize all these parts. But we're going to just focus on a few that we're going to use for grass identification. So here in this part of the grass, where we're going to pay a lot of attention to this ligule and auricle. So these two are what my go-to plant parts when I'm identifying a grass. These are the first things I look at, especially, a lot of times we don't have a seed head or an inflorescence to look at when we're identifying grasses. So these parts of the plant you'll always have to look at. So it's a good thing to get used to looking for those parts. So the auricle here, we see this thing sticking up, coming up out of the leaf sheath. So some grasses have no, oh, sorry, I meant ligule. Some grasses have no ligule, others have hairy ligules or very short ligules. In this picture, this grass has a very long ligule. So any publication that you have or grass ID type book is going to talk about these two plant parts. So, and then the auricle, you can see this in this picture. This would be considered a clasping auricle. It's kind of clasping around the stem there. Again, some plants don't have any auricles, some have hairy auricles, some have short auricles. So those two are really important to know when you're talking about grass identification. And then we're going to look a little bit more at the parts of the inflorescence. So this is the spikelet. So you can see the spikelet contains many parts. Again, we're not going to really go into depth in these different parts for identification purposes. We're going to look more about how the spikelets are arranged on the grass and their general shape and size. One important thing to look at would be that awn there at the top. So it's kind of a hair-like structure that's coming out of the spike. So that can be important to use when identifying. Some plants have long awns, some have none, some have kind of curly awns as they dry, some have 2 to 3 awns. So that is a good part to also be aware of. So there's 3 types of inflorescences when we talk about grasses. So we have the panicle. Well, so first we're going to talk about this word rachis. Rachis here. That is it's the stem of the inflorescence. So on a panicle, this first one here, you have branches coming off of the rachis, or that stem. So that would be what would make it a panicle. So some examples would be switchgrass or alkali saccaton, which is in this photo here down on the left. We're going to skip over to the far left, a spike. So a spike will have the spikelets directly attached to the rachis. So some examples of that would be western wheatgrass, barley, or timothy. And then the middle one, the raceme, I kind of use that as a catch-all for anything that doesn't fit into the other two inflorescent types. So if the rachis doesn't branch and or the spikelets are not directly attached to the rachis, it would be a raceme. So usually they have pedicels, which are little attachments that it's almost like a small stem that attaches the spikelet to the rachis. So that would be a raceme. So an example of that would be blue grama grass, side oats grama, and the picture I accidentally showed you before, the Dallas grass. So we all probably know what photosynthesis is, but very quick overview. The plants use water and carbon dioxide with sun energy from the sunlight and green leaf material. They convert it to carbohydrates or energy and oxygen. And nutrients are important as well in this, but we are not going to go into that right now. So the energy for the grass. So the initial energy from the seed is stored in the seed, and the plants use that to get their first few leaves up. Once they get enough leaves up, they can start photosynthesizing. So the first few leaves are coming from a stored energy. So that's whether it's coming from a seed or in the early spring growth or after a severe defoliation. So if during the grazing season you mow it to the ground or graze it to the ground, it's going to have to use that stored growth to get enough leaves up to start photosynthesizing sufficiently. The older leaves photosynthesize less and leaves will eventually die. And so energy reserves. So the plant is going to store extra carbohydrates when it has that available. So with grasses, it's going to be stored mostly in the roots and crown of the plant. And most of that energy is going to be stored when the leaf growth is complete and late in the growing season. So as you go into fall, those plants are going to be pushing a lot of energy down into their roots and crown to store for the next year's growth. So when we look at how grasses grow, so first we're going to start with these individual growth units, which are called tillers or shoots. We're going to call them tillers today. So we have vegetative tillers, which will only ever produce roots and leaves. And then we have our reproductive tillers, which are going to produce seed heads and stems in addition to those roots and leaves. So we can kind of think of a grass growing like a not a kaleidoscope, a telescope, sorry, a telescope. So those older leaves are going to be those leaves down there at the bottom. Those new leaves are coming up kind of from the center there. Excuse me. So the crown of the plant is important. the crown is where buds are going to develop, that which will produce new tillers. So that whether that be for this year, depending on how we manage our grasses, or for next spring, those buds are really important. So these are just some pictures I took from out in my yard. So you can see that new leaf coming up from the center. And then the right side is a picture of Kentucky bluegrass. So you see the new leaves and tillers coming up there from the bottom. So the growing points are the only parts of the grasses where the growth is actually occurring. So the correct term is meristem. We're going to call them growing points today. So these are the tissues of growth, so where cells divide and or elongate. So the apical meristem is at the apex of the tiller, which produces leaves, stems, and seed heads. And then we have the intercalary meristem, which increases the length of the leaves and sheaths. So you can see, oops, sorry. So there in that picture that is circled now, you can see where the apical meristem is. And here, right at the top of that leaf, or the bottom, I guess, of the leaf, is that intercalary meristem. Sorry. So you can see the color difference in the actual picture of where that growing point is. So that's where that leaf is pushing new growth out from. So there's 3 stages of growth in the grass plant. So we'll just start with the vegetative phase. This is where the leaves are predominantly leaf blades. There's no sheath elongation or culm or stem development at this point. The growing point will continue to produce leaves until conditions induce the transition stage. So at this point, the number of leaves that the plant can produce is infinite. So until it's pushed into the next phase. So also when we're thinking about forage quality, this is where you have very high forage quality. You got high protein, high digestibility, high sugars. So usually it's mostly temperature and day length are gonna push these plants to go into the transition phase, also along with hormones, plant hormones. So once it gets pushed into the transition phase, when there's sufficient leaf area, the growing point is converted from a vegetative bud into a reproductive bud, and then it's rapidly going to elongate the leaf sheaths and the culm internodes or stem internodes. So at this point, you start to elevate. You can see on the leaves where that leaf growing point is elevated, and also the apical meristem is also elevated at this point. And then you're going to go into that reproductive phase where the seed head is actually going to come up and eventually produce viable seeds. So when we think about how to best manage grass and think about the effects of defoliation, the main thing is, what are your specific goals and use for your grass and grass type? That's going to determine how we manage our grasses. So is it turf? Is it lawn? Are your kids out there playing on it? What type of grass is it is also important. Is it more ornamental or in landscaping? Are you trying to restore an area or just keep an area nice that's on your property? Or if you're going to graze it or produce food such as corn, wheat, grains type of thing. So now we're going to talk specifically about defoliation and grass's response to being defoliated. So by defoliation, could be grazing, mowing, cutting, even walking on it too much or anything like that. That's going to end up breaking off parts of the plant. So first, we're going to talk about removal of those growing points. So when we think about where those growing points are, if you remove those, that can no longer grow. So if you have just the leaf and you cut the leaf in half, that leaf can continue to grow. And same with the apical meristem. If you remove that, then that tiller can never regrow. That tiller is going to was dead, and the plant is going to have to produce a new tiller by using the buds at the crown. So because of that, that early transition stage is the most vulnerable time to defoliate a plant. The growing points are being elevated at that time, but the buds are not fully developed. So if you remove the growing points, it wants to initiate the bud growth, but they're not developed yet. So it's going to really slow down regrowth. There's minimal danger of mismanagement during the vegetative state, as long as you don't, graze or mow it all the way to the ground over and over. If it's in that vegetative state, usually those growing points remain intact, and that plant can regrow from that tiller and or leaf. the least amount of danger for defoliating is during dormancy. So during the winter, usually you're not going to hurt the plant as long as you don't have animals out there when it's muddy or something and you're damaging the crown of the plant. But you do want to keep in mind protecting your soil and retaining precipitation. So it's best to keep at least 3 to 4 inches of growth even through the winter. So here's a photo of this past summer. This is a cool season grass. I cut it in probably maybe July or June. I removed those growing points. So you can see all these old tillers where I cut it down and it had to initiate growth from the buds on the crown and put up brand new tillers. So that's kind of what you would see in that case, those kind of old tillers that were not able to regrow. So this just same thing we're talking about. So in the vegetative state here at the top, the growing point stays very low to the ground. So if you mow it or defoliate it in any way, the growing points remain intact. The plant can regrow from those same tillers or leaves. And then you can see once it goes into the transition or reproductive stage, it's going to elongate those tillers. The growing points are elevated. So when the grass is defoliated, the growing points were removed and the regrowth has to come from new buds. And you can see that those old tillers that are no longer able to grow. So another important thing to think about is the different types of grass. So that's important for a lot of reasons, but it also different types of grass produce a different amount of reproductive tillers. So you can read this on your own, but some of the common ones that we have are a lot of the hay, the grasses we cut for hay that are high in reproductive tillers, smooth brome and timothy. So those are common, but the important thing to look at is the low, because these plants that produce a low amount of reproductive tillers are going to produce more vegetative tillers. So if you look at those, the blue grama, buffalo grass, and Kentucky bluegrass, those are really common to use as kind of a turf type grass. They stay looking kind of nice. You can kind of walk on them depending on the variety as well. That's important, but they're just not going to produce as many stemmy tillers with seed heads on them. Okay, so the next really important thing to think about when defoliating our grasses is the remaining leaf area. So the leaf area is, where the photosynthesis is mainly occurring. So if you don't have enough leaf area, that plant can't photosynthesize. So here are some examples of pastures. So if we graze our pasture down to look like this picture on the left, how are those plants going to regrow? They are going to have to use stored carbohydrates to regrow. So if you continue to allow your animals to graze this down to this point, eventually those carbohydrate reserves are going to be exhausted and the plants can eventually die. So it's very important when you think about the plant also has a negative effect on the animals for sure, especially if you're doing any type of operation where you're selling meat or dairy or anything like that. Also, it's important to think about the soil. What are the effects on the soil here? It's going to change your microclimate. So your soil temperatures are going to have more drastic changes. Your loss of water you think here, you can see it's a little bit wet here. The soil is a little wet down here at the bottom of that picture. How quickly is that going to dry out at this point if you have a windy, warm day? Also thinking about capturing precipitation, erosion, water and wind erosion here is much more likely to cause harmful effects. So we don't want to do this for multiple reasons. So the picture on the right is what we'd want our pasture to look like when we take our animals out. And it's also really important to think like what is your regrowth rate going to be like? Your grass is going to regrow much quicker if you leave sufficient regrowth. Leave sufficient residual grass there. Okay. So that rest and regrowth period is very important. So even if that does happen, you mow it too low or you left your animals in there too long, as long as you give that grass a long enough rest and regrowth period, it should recover. So the other important thing to think about with regrowth is how fast is it going to regrow. So that's going to depend on grass type, severity of defoliation, but also hugely on the season and water. So in the spring, you might expect really quick regrowth. Of course, in the summer, if it's cool season, it might be very slow to regrow. So we can't set a schedule on that. You can't say like, oh, every 3 weeks I'm going to move my animals back in this pasture. I'm going to mow this area because depends on your water and season and grass types. So also very important is the effect on your roots. So we often with grazing, we use this take half, leave half. So we want to put the animals out there when there's 8 inches. We want to take them out when there's 4 inches. And that's for all the reasons we talked about, but also the effect on the roots. They've done studies that show after you use more than 50% of the above ground growth, it has a huge impact on the root. So it stops root growth at that point and also can actually shrink the root. So your plants are going to be less drought tolerant, to be able to compete against weeds and undesirable plants. They're getting weaker. So um, we don't want to do that. So our take home points are, what are your goals for your grasses? That's important to know before you make any best management practice plans. What type of grasses do you have? We are able to help you with that. If you would like, you can always send us pictures. You can bring samples in here to your extension office. We can help you identify what kind of grass it is and how to best manage it. We want to make sure we leave sufficient leaf area after defoliating grasses so that it can regrow quickly and that we don't harmfully affect the soil. Consider the growing point location when you do decide to defoliate. Fall management is key. Those buds for spring growth are formed prior to winter dormancy, so important to let those grasses get a little bit of growth at that point. Also, the grasses are really pushing carbohydrates down into their roots and crowns to store it for the next great growing season at that point. So identification of grasses is difficult to do online. So we will, I'll just briefly talk about, some of these things you're gonna look for. Then I'll share one publication I really like to use that has really great pictures. So when we're looking at grass identification, first thing is let's determine, is it a warm or cool season grass? When is it growing? So that depends when you're out there looking at it, of course. Is it a sod forming or bunch grass? So this one can be tricky because there's some grasses that are slightly sod forming. So you can really get down there and kind of dig around near the crown or the base of the plant to see if you can find rhizomes or stolons in there. The size of the plant, a lot of the publications available on Grass ID will talk about the different sizes of the plant, so that can be useful. The width of the leaves is important. Also, if the leaf is rolled or folded or flat. The presence of hairs, so you can see the picture here on the right has kind of a hairy ligule or hairy auricles, and there's also grasses can have hairy leaves, so that will be important when trying to identify your grasses. Those plant parts that we talked about, you can look for awns or awnlets. If you don't have a seed head, you can look at the ligule and auricles, and that can help you to identify. So this is the publication one of the publications I really like to use for grasses. It's from Utah State University, but it has, we have a lot of the same grasses here as they have there. So this is great. It has really great pictures, like I said. So I would suggest this to anyone. You can get this online as well, an online version. Their website to the Utah State University, you can just go in there and type in any type of grass you want, and it gives you all the information that you need. So it's really a great tool. So that's all I have for now. Thank you all so much for listening. If you can or are willing to, this is not required, but if you can help us out with filling out these brief surveys, TSU has us collect demographic information to make sure we're serving everyone in our counties and our state. So if you could help us out with that, we really appreciate it. The other survey is just specifically on this program and what you would like to see change, if you have any suggestions, and also helps us to report our impact. So we would really appreciate it if you guys could take the time to do that. And again, here is our contact information. Feel free to reach out to us at any time. Like I said, we can help identify weeds or grasses or whatever plants you have. We do site visits, can help you with anything like that, we're happy to help. So thank you again. Have a good day.